One day a student came to me and said, "Mr. V, I don't like that poster. I feel like the eye is judging me." And when I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Well, everybody's private life is different from their public life, right?" I thought about that for a while, and it led me to think about sex. Now, you may think that's strange, but I'm a sexuality educator. Pretty much everything leads me to think about sex. So, what if the poster said, "How do you live your sexual life when nobody's watching?" When you start to unravel that question, you see some pretty interesting things. Like, for example, it's perfectly okay to have massive billboards of nearly naked people in very public places like Times Square. But a lot of people would get really freaked out if a woman was breastfeeding her baby there. The way we deal with public and private when it comes to sex can seem pretty messed up and unfair. But I think if we start focusing on what's fair and unfair, we actually miss the mark. Because the distinctions about how our society deals with public and private when it comes to sex, that's not about fairness. That's about justice. And that's what I really want to talk about today. So first of all, notice that equality and justice are not the same thing, not by a long shot. Equality says, let's give everybody the same thing. Justice says, let's give each person what they need so that everyone has the same access to a successful outcome. So equality thinks about what happens up front, and justice is concerned with the end result. So a lot of people, when they think about sexuality, they think about what's between our legs and what we do with it. Or they think about maybe our sexual and romantic attraction, so our sexual orientation. But that's a really limited definition of sexuality. This is a screenshot from a video called "Human Sexuality is Complicated" by Hank Green. He's one of the Vlog brothers. And what you can see in this graphic is that sexuality does include what's between our legs. It does include our sexual and romantic attractions. It includes our sexual behaviors. But there's more than that. Sexuality also includes our gender identity and our gender expression, who we feel like we most fundamentally are, and how we bring that into the world. And sexuality also includes, see that orange box, also includes all the messages that we get from society that tell us what they think we should be doing with our sexuality. Here's the thing. You're a sexual person 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You were a sexual person the moment that you were born. You'll be a sexual person until the day you die. Now, you're not always sexually active, because that would be exhausting. And you'd never get your homework done. But the reality is, you can't walk out into the world without carrying all of these things with you. Now, you can't leave your genitals at home when you go to school in the morning. And you can't turn off your sexual desires during a math test. So sexuality is a big concept. And it really does impact every minute of our day. Okay, so let's get back to thinking about some of the outcomes that people are looking for when it comes to sex. When people are publicly or privately expressing their sexuality, what are they looking for? There's a million things they're looking for. Pleasure, fun, connection, companionship, intimacy, choice, feeling good about their bodies, developing a sense of desirability, maybe even having a child. And there's a lot more besides that. And those are all really good fundamental things. So here's the thing. What does this have to do with justice? What does sexual justice look like? Well, here's a question that we can use to frame that. How is just sex different than just sex? See what I did there? Kind of cool. Well, here's the thing. Justice is based on some key principles. And what I want to do is just talk about a couple of key principles and how they relate to sex to create what I call sexual justice. Okay? So, the first principle of justice, and it's really important in sexual justice, is called human dignity. And all that means is every human being is worthy of love, dignity, and respect just because they're a human being. It's not okay for us to use another person as a glorified sex toy for our personal pleasure. Just sex demands real consent. It demands that the other person's satisfaction and pleasure and desires are as important as our own. Just sex also means that I don't have to give up who I am to be with you, and you don't have to give up who you are to be with me. And the interactions that we make together, whether it's a hookup or a casual date or a committed relationship, has to work for both of us. The second principle that is important for sexual justice is community solidarity and participation. See, sexual justice recognizes that we're all in this together, but it also recognizes that we're not all the same. There's a way where you can actually honor individuality without disrupting community. And the way you do that is you recognize what's different, but you don't judge difference as better or worse or good or bad. So you acknowledge difference, you recognize it, and then you also recognize that our community, whether it's a little community of a couple of people or a big community of a school or a bigger community like a world, can't be what it is unless all of those differences are present. Just sex means that we acknowledge that there are all kinds of family structures and romantic relationship structures, and that they are different, but that they're all valid. See, just sex means that we allow everybody in the community to participate, and through participation, we build solidarity. All right, next, just sex means that individuals, and especially institutions, have to ensure everyone's rights and call everyone to their responsibilities. So marriage equality is a great example of this, right? So when my sweetie and I were finally able to get married, when same-gender marriage became legal, we enjoyed a whole bunch of rights that came with getting married. We also took on a whole bunch of responsibilities that legally married couples share. And that is really the way it should work. It's really important that we see who are the people whose rights are not being honored in terms of sex and in terms of who they are as sexual human beings, and how can we let them come into community, assume their rights, and then also acknowledge their responsibilities. As a matter of fact, what sexual justice says is we have to pay extra special attention to those people who are poor and vulnerable. So the oppressed, the marginalized, those people who aren't seen or who are seen but disregarded. So, think about sex in your own community, in your school, in your family, in your place of worship, in your world. Who are those people who are marginalized, unseen? And how do we especially enhance their rights so that they can have the same access to the successful sexual outcomes that we enjoy? That's really important. And lastly, sexual justice and all justice has to work for the promotion of peace. Well, war actually isn't the opposite of peace. War is just a symptom of the lack of peace. The real opposite of peace is fear. And all the things that come with fear, mistrust and defensiveness and abuse of power, and those things have a lot to do with sex. So sexual justice means we have to work really hard against things like sexual assault and sexual abuse and sexual coercion and sexual bullying. Because there's one thing that can totally derail sexual justice. It's the enemy of all justice, and it's called privilege. Privilege is unearned access or power or status. So it's being given an advantage not because of anything you did, but because of some inherent quality you have or because of some group you belong to, maybe a majority group. Now, the hard thing about privilege is that very often people who have privilege don't recognize it. But we can learn to recognize it. I've had to do that. So, for example, I amass an incredible amount of privilege in society by being white and male and cisgender and able-bodied and middle class and highly educated. And the fact that I'm gay, that doesn't erase all the privilege I get from all those other things. Something that you thought worked just fine for everybody only works fine for you or people like you. Once we recognize our privilege and once we acknowledge it and decide that we're really going to do something about it, we can actually use privilege in a really subversive way, right? Because privilege is about access and power. So if I recognize my privilege as a white person or as a cisgender male, I can use that access and power to open up doors to people who don't have the same privilege. And that's a really cool thing to do. Privilege gives us a certain amount of freedom. And as Toni Morrison, who's an amazing American author, has said, the purpose of freedom is to free somebody else. So today I'm inviting you to join with me on a quest for sexual justice, to put your thirst for justice above the comfort of your own privilege. Together, think of what we could do. We could be a mighty force, a force for good. We could be a sexual justice league. Yes. So the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And President Obama, while he was still a senator, reflected on Dr. King's words. And here's what he said. It bends towards justice, but here's the thing. It does not bend on its own. It bends because each of us, in our own way, puts our hands on that arc, and we bend it in the direction of justice. Justice doesn't just happen. It's created. It's intentional. It means acknowledging some hard truths and then putting our hands to the task of reshaping the world. You are the generation that can take the quest for sexual justice further than my generation ever could. Thank you for that. Thank you for being willing today to join with me to make the world better, to light the way to a world that is brighter and more sexually just. Thanks for your time.